You ever think about how weird folktales are? Take Little Red Riding Hood, for example. A little girl sets off into the woods to go and visit her grandmother, but along the way, she's visited by a talking wolf who races ahead of her to her grandmother's house, kills and eats her grandmother, dresses up in her clothes, gets into her bed, so when Little Red arrives, she thinks that the wolf is her grandmother, and the wolf eats her, and a passing huntsman has to come by and save the day by killing the wolf and cutting both the girl and the grandmother out of the wolf's belly.
What?
I mean, what are we supposed to get out of a story like that? Well, finding the answer to that is going to take us on a darker journey than maybe you'd expect, into the heart of the miserable, death-infused, disease-ridden, toil-filled lives of 18th century French peasants. Let's jump in. Fair warning, some of the content in this video is going to get pretty graphic and dark, so you've been warned. Our first instinct for interpreting the story of Little Red Riding Hood might be to ask the psychoanalysts. Hey psychoanalysts, what do you think about Little Red Riding Hood? Easy, say German psychoanalysts Erich Fromm and Bruno Bettelheim. Clearly, the story symbolically recounts a young woman's confrontation with adult sexuality and the triumph of the superego over the id. The red hood, you see, represents Little Red's menstruation. Too young for adult sex, yet too old for oral fixation. She is led astray by the pleasure principle into the jaws of the wolf, or the id, which represents the fully sexually mature adult male who is also her father and also her grandfather, and the two stones placed in the wolf's belly by the huntsman, who represents the superego, symbolize sterility and the wolf's punishment for committing a sexual act of violence. The whole thing is quite simple, really. Okay, except in the original version of the Little Red Riding Hood story, none of that actually happened. Fromm and Bettelheim just got the story from the brothers Grimm. They didn't consider where the story had originally come from. If we're gonna understand what this story truly means, we're gonna have to analyze it as a historical document.
So I want you to think history, okay?
As Robert Darnton points out in his seminal work of cultural history, The Great Cat Massacre, and other episodes of French cultural history, Fromm and Bettelheim must have gotten their version of the story from the Grimm brothers. And the Grimm brothers, operating in the early 19th century, must have gotten their version indirectly from French publications by the likes of Charles Perrault, who had watered down the versions of the stories in order to fit the tastes of the French tempered, aristocratic, literate class. The red hood, the stones, the huntsman, all of that was stuff tacked on later in order to make the story more digestible and more silly and whimsical. The real version goes like this. Once, a little girl was told by her mother to bring some bread and milk to her grandmother. As the girl was walking through the forest, a wolf came up to her and asked where she was going. To grandmother's house, she replied. Which path are you taking? The path of the pins or the path of the needles? The path of the needles. So the wolf took the path of the pins and arrived first at the house. He killed the grandmother, poured her blood in a bottle, and sliced her flesh onto a platter. Then he got into her nightclothes and waited in bed. Knock, knock. Come in, my dear. Hello, grandmother. I've brought you some bread and milk. Have something for yourself, my dear. There is meat and wine in the pantry. So the little girl ate what was offered, and as she did, a little cat said, Slut, to eat the flesh and drink the blood of your grandmother. Then the wolf said, Undress and get into bed with me. Where shall I put my apron? Throw it on the fire. You won't need it anymore. For each garment, bodice, skirt, petticoat, and stockings, the girl asked the same question, and each time the wolf answered, Throw it on the fire. You won't need it anymore. When the girl got in bed, she said, Oh, grandmother, how hairy you are. It's to keep me warmer, my dear. Oh, grandmother, what big shoulders you have. It's for better carrying firewood, my dear. Oh, grandmother, what long nails you have. It's for scratching myself better, my dear. Oh, grandmother, what big teeth you have. It's for eating you better, my dear. And he ate her. What a bedtime story, huh? Jesus. So apparently the other Grimm brothers stories are like this too. Take Sleeping Beauty, for example. In the original, Prince Charming is already married and has several children with Sleeping Beauty before she wakes up. And then her mother, who's also an ogre, tries to eat the kids. Or there's another story that is so beyond the pale I can hardly even believe it. It's called My Mother Killed Me, My Father Ate Me, in which a mother kills her son, chops him up and cooks him into a casserole, and then forces her daughter to feed the son to the father. What the hell could be the purpose of these kinds of stories beyond just terrifying children? Well, it's kind of hard to say, right? I mean, it's impossible for us to put ourselves into the minds of 18th century French peasants. Imagine if you died today and all of your friends and loved ones had to piece together what your mental world was like just by reading through your text messages, your emails, random post-it notes left on the desk. It would be pretty impossible. Now add the extra complication of there being 200 years of distance between us and the people who told these stories, and the task is pretty tough. But that being said, let's just try to do it anyway. One way we might be able to get a little bit closer to understanding this version of Little Red Riding Hood would be to reconstruct the historical context in which it was told. In other words, let's find out what day-to-day life was like for an 18th century French peasant. Not too great, it turns out. As Robert Darnton points out, life was an inexorable struggle against death everywhere in early modern France. Fair warning one more time, the stuff in this section can be pretty hard to hear. Inefficient farming techniques meant that most peasants were suffering from basically chronic malnutrition. They had to subsist on bread and porridge, maybe a vegetable here and there, but almost never meat, maybe once or twice a year. The men had to labor all day long from sunrise to sunset, and women were expected to give birth 5 or 6 times, and maybe 3 of those babies were expected to reach adulthood. 45% of males would be dead by the age of 10. And this chronic malnutrition meant that when disease came rolling through a village, people were especially vulnerable. Not to mention the taxes, rents, tithes, debt peonage that kept the poor poor. This extreme poverty, Darnton tells us, meant that most families were sleeping in 1 or maybe 2 beds altogether, meaning not only, quite disturbingly, that children were often witnesses to their parents' sexual activities, but also often infants were accidentally smothered by their parents in bed. If children did survive until the point that they could walk, they were basically put to work more or less immediately. Clearly, the mental worlds of the people living through this time would have been pretty preoccupied with starvation and also death, especially the death of children. We can see this preoccupation with childhood mortality play out in lots of these folktales. Take Tom Thumb, for example, which is a French version of Hansel and Gretel. In this version of the story, a poor family is forced to abandon their children in order to survive a famine. Once upon a time, there lived a woodcutter and his wife. They had 7 children, all boys. The eldest was but 10 years old, and the youngest only 7. They were very poor, and their 7 children inconvenienced them greatly, because not one of them was able to earn his own way. They were especially concerned because the youngest was very sickly. There came a very bad year, and the famine was so great that these poor people decided to rid themselves of their children. One evening, when the children were all in bed and the woodcutter was sitting with his wife at the fire, he said to her, with his heart ready to burst with grief, "You see plainly that we are not able to keep our children, and I cannot see them starve to death before my face. I am resolved to lose them in the woods tomorrow, which may very easily be done. For while they are busy in tying up the bundles of wood, we can leave them without their noticing." Very often, early modern French peasants would have been faced with exactly this kind of decision. Abandon your children, or watch them starve. And beyond the stark reality of domestic life in French villages was the equally terrifying reality of traveling on the road. Boys, who were afforded at this time more freedom than their female counterparts, often would abandon the village in order to seek better fortunes on the road. And when they did that, they were braving a countryside that was riddled with violent gangs and wolves. Of course, now there are no wolves in the French countryside, but at this time they had not been eradicated yet. So getting killed or eaten was very much a concern. Take this excerpt from Tom Thumb one more time. "Night now came on, and there arose a terrible high wind, which made them dreadfully afraid. They fancied they heard on every side of them the howling of wolves coming to eat them. They scarcely dared to speak or turn their heads." The presence of wolves in the story adds an element of realism, not fantasy. Even in Little Red Riding Hood, while that wolf is a talking wolf, and that adds an element of whimsical fantasy to the story, the reality of encountering a dangerous wolf on the road was absolutely real. It's not hard to imagine that including them in these stories would have been instructive for listeners. So while these folktales are not exactly perfect pictures of reality, they do always offer some element of realism. As Darnton points out, the picture fits. By showing how life was lived terre à terre in the village and on the road, the tales helped orient the peasants. They mapped the ways of the world and demonstrated the folly of expecting anything more than cruelty from a cruel social order. By comparison with the more jaunty and whimsical versions of these stories found in England, and the more mystical and supernatural versions found in Germany, these French folktales reveal a mentality that is deeply pragmatic, deeply down-to-earth, and instructional in nature. They suggest a careful, slow-moving orientation to a harsh world. They warn the listener to be clever, lest you be robbed, killed, eaten, or abandoned. But Little Red Riding Hood in particular goes even deeper than that. Of course, we all know that sometimes death may come without any rhyme or reason. Sometimes the divine plan or fate or destiny, whatever you want to call it, seems arbitrary. Why, Job asks, is light given to him who suffers, and life to the bitter of soul? Take this story that Darnton summarizes for us, called Les Deux Bossus, or The Two Hunchbacks. In this story, two hunchbacks are traveling along the road and they encounter a couple of witches. The witches are going along and they're singing, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. One of the hunchbacks jumps in and says, and Thursday. And the witches are delighted, they clap and they sing, and they reward the hunchback by casting a spell and removing his hunch. The second hunchback then says, and Friday. But the witches are not impressed. No, that doesn't go at all, they say. And they curse him with the hunchback they removed from the first one. Now doubly deformed and humiliated, that second hunchback doesn't live longer than a year. Disaster strikes fortuitously. Like the Black Death, it cannot be predicted or explained. It must simply be endured. In the version of Little Red Riding Hood recounted earlier, when the wolf devours Little Red, she had done nothing to deserve such a fate. She did not disobey her mother, or fail to read the signs of an implicit moral order written in the world around her. She simply walked into the jaws of death. It is the inscrutable, inexorable character of calamity that makes the tale so moving. A folktale doesn't need an arc like a novel. It doesn't need catharsis, unlike what some psychoanalysts might think. A folktale just presents the world back to the listener or the reader like some kind of dark mirror, that the more it distorts, the more paradoxically accurate its depiction of reality becomes. Little Red Riding Hood is much more than just a story for kids. It is a parable that provokes in us that same feeling that we get when life appears to make no sense to us. It offers us no solution, only the comfort of knowing that we are not alone in the feeling that life can be utterly baffling. As the French saying goes, one must howl with the wolves. Thanks for watching.